Well, thank you very much. It's really an honor to be here, and it's really great to see some old faces, not old in age, just mature or geriatric, and also some familiar faces, including a couple of former students. I'm going to talk tonight, well, first of all, about why a book called The Geriatric Pilgrim, which is essentially about some of the pilgrimages that my wife Mary Lee and I have made, why that's here in a program in the Yarmouth History Center, and what the connection is between that and Yarmouth history. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about my Yarmouth history, and that's growing up in Yarmouth in the 50s, well, 40s actually, 40s, 50s, and 60s. And my relationship and writing about it, and there's a number of chapters in this book. I'm going to read a couple, which are going to talk about some of my negotiations, I guess would be the best word, with my past. And I've had a sort of ambivalent, shall we say, relationship with both Yarmouth and my past, and I've tried to work some of that out in this book, and I'm going to read a couple of examples from the book about, first of all, negotiating my past, and then how I at least have used the past. I'm really fascinated by the past, and how the various ways in which people use it. And I've done a fair amount of reading, including, if you're looking for a book on that, I just finished about a 600 and some odd page book called The Past is a Foreign Country. I don't know if any of you have read that. Have you read that before? But it's fascinating. It's about all the different ways we use the past. And so I want to talk about ways in which I have sort of negotiated my past in a way that I think gives me a lot of hope for the future. And so I want to talk about that as well. So I'm going to start by talking about the book itself and how it came to be written. It started about 2015, 2016. I just written a book, Katie mentioned, about the death of my daughter. And my daughter died when she was 18 of a sort of strange, weird cancer. And as you can imagine, that changed my life a great deal. And I spent 20 years writing this book. And when I finally came out, I was exhausted, and I wasn't quite sure how to, and I was looking for something that was fun. And so by this time, Mary Lee and I had done quite a bit of traveling, and that was one of the ways I think we coped with Lori's death was to travel. And we saw a movie, I don't know if you've ever seen the movie called The Way with Martin Sheen, and it's about a man who, one of the most famous pilgrimages is the pilgrimage of the Santiago to Compostela, which runs from France to Spain. And this was about Martin Sheen walking it in honor of his son, who had died making the trip. And it's a feel-good movie, and I'm not sure it's the greatest movie, but it hit us. And we thought, that really looks neat. Well, at this point, I'm about 70, and my wife is a little younger. And we're saying, I don't know if 500-mile walk is really in our repertoire. So we looked around for a shorter one, and we found a pilgrimage called St. Cuthbert's Way, which is in England. Actually starts in Scotland and then goes to the holy island of Lindisfarne off the coast of England. It's about a 60-mile walk. And if you space it out over 5 days, that's not bad, And so we did that, and we really enjoyed it. And I got very interested in pilgrimages, just the whole idea of what a pilgrimage is and how it differs from a vacation, how it differs from a business trip, how it differs from going to school, just the things that sort of separate a pilgrim. I read all kinds of books. I can tell you what they are if you want. But and in reading them, I think that what really resonated with me was the fact that one of the things that separates a pilgrimage from other journeys is that the interior journey is as important, if not more important, than the exterior journey. You're making a journey, well, as one person put it, to find a source of healing. Well, of course, that was something that I was doing a lot of at that point, was trying to find a source of healing. And because it was interior, what I discovered was that a lot of my interior had to do with growing up in Yarmouth. And it was really strange. In fact, this became really weird once, because Marilee and I were doing something Marilee had always wanted to do. We were doing a trip to Tanzania in the Serengeti Plain, and wildlife, and seeing all the animals and giraffes, and wonderful. And we're driving to the Serengeti Plain, and what am I doing? I'm replaying the 1961 Western Maine state basketball championship. And for the whole time there, I'm all in 1961. And that was fine as long as we were getting there, but I couldn't turn it off. And so I kept doing, wow, what is going on here? Why am I so obsessed? I'm missing everything. And it took me, I think, a day or so to get that out of my head. And that was when I began to realize, there are different kinds of pilgrimages. They don't have to be religious. Marilee and I do follow religion. We are faithful churchgoers. But I think of myself more as spiritual than religious. But I also know of people that make other kinds of pilgrimages. Pilgrimages to Fenway Park. How many of you have been to Graceland? Okay, Grace, and, even as simple as the pilgrimage I'm going to guess a lot of you are going to make in the next 2 weeks. Anybody know where that is? The family cemetery. And it carries all the characteristics of a pilgrimage. You're going to pay homage. You're going to seek some sort of connection with the holy, if you will, or the spiritual. And so I began to think in terms of my growing up. And this was about the same time. First of all, I had moved back to Yarmouth. And I had, as I said, this sort of strange relationship with Yarmouth. When I was 18 years old, I couldn't wait to get out of this damn place. I just stomped at the bit. I just couldn't wait. And I ran into a former classmate, Clam Festival or something, who was visiting. She lives in New Mexico. And she said, the one thing I remember about you was, she said, you were going to get out of here, and you told me I should get out of here too. And so I wanted to get out of here. So at 18, I want to get out of here. At 42, I couldn't wait to get back. And that had to do with a divorce, had to do with breakup and a lot of different things that were going on. And so I came back here. Couldn't wait to get back here. And then when my daughter died several years after that, I bought a house right here in town. I bought my grandparents' house up on Baker Street. And lived there for, Marilee and I, we drove by. We just said, look, before we come here, let's drive by. So I drove by just to look at it. And we lived there for 21 years. I thought I would probably live there for the rest of my life. And then about 10 years ago, no, it was time to move. So now we moved to Brunswick. And, but it was interesting, in that move to Brunswick, that was when I got really sort of interested in what was going on in my life. Because when I had lived here, especially during the 21 years after Lori died, I tended to either glorify my past, sort of cloak it in this aura of nostalgia. You know, it was wonderful growing up in Yarmouth. Everybody looked after everybody else. The food was better. The music was better. The men were stronger. The women were better looking. You get these emails, right? I mean, you get them all. Things were so much better in 1950. Somebody wrote a book saying, they did a survey, and they said, when was the best time to be alive in America? And the survey said 1957. So this was this ideal time. Or, as I found out, I spent an awful lot of time denying things. And I found that out when I began to get involved with 12-step programs. And for various and sundry reasons, I found myself in 12-step programs. And trying to understand some of the difficulties that I had had. And I remember I got a sponsor. And I remember meeting with my sponsor, and she said to me, well, we're going to start by looking at your life before the age of 10. And I said, I don't remember anything about my life before the age of 10. I said, after 10, I can tell you all kinds of things. Can't tell you a thing about it. And she said, why do you suppose that is? And so I began to approach my past in a little different sort of way. And I began to say, okay, why can't I? Well, without going into my family background, my parents both grew up in very difficult circumstances. There was a lot of alcoholism. And I began to realize that had sort of rubbed off and had contributed to a lot of things that were going on. So I began to sort of explore, and this is where the pilgrim thing comes in, explore the past as if it were, as this book said, a foreign country. And so I'm going to start by reading one of the first things I wrote, actually, about this time. And Katie, if you would, I started with pictures. And so I was going through and I ran into this picture. Now, I don't know how many of you, I know there are a few of you here, who grew up the same time I did. And I don't know how many of these you're going to recognize. I can tell you who they all are. I can tell you this is my parents' living room. Note the pine paneling, those of you who grew up in the 1950s and 60s. Okay. And these are people who are very much a part of my life. And working around here, starting from the far left, are the Ralstons. Their daughter was in my class, okay? Followed by the Prides, that is Earl and Doris Pride, whom I suspect some of you may remember. Stan and Ethel Haskell. This is my father. These are the Jameses. And this is Scotty and Dottie Campbell, he was the pastor at the First Parish Church. And some of you nodding your head, some of you remember Scott. He was an amazing guy. There's some amazing people in here. I wrote about Stan. Stan is in the book. I have a book about Stan, because Stan is one of those people that was a tremendous influence on me for the better. And so I wrote about Stan. But I looked at these people, these two people. I know their names were Tully, but that's all I know about them. I don't think they lived that long in Yarmouth. But this is a party at my parents' house. So I got to look, and that was a starting place. And I said, okay, what can I figure out here? What can I figure out about their influence on me? And as it happened, had a car appointment to get my car checked. And this was during COVID. And I realized I hadn't been driving that much, but I got thinking about my car, and I got thinking about here. So I got thinking, and I put them together. And I wrote this, which is called, some of you will remember this, the Sunday Afternoon Drive. The other day, I got a notice that my car needed its next scheduled service. I realized that whether because of the pandemic or my increased age, I don't drive as often or as far as I used to, which got me thinking about a forgotten era in my life, in the life of many geriatrics, I suspect, the Sunday afternoon drive. For me, this era lasted from the late 1940s, when my parents bought their first automobile, to the mid-1950s, when the advent of television and Sunday afternoon sports kept my friends and their parents at home. During that time, on Sunday afternoons, from spring into the fall, anywhere from 3 to 7 families, the Wiles and the Prides and the Loomises, the Ralstons and the Haskells, the Teffs and the Jameses, would pile into their cars and spend the afternoon traveling the back roads of southern Maine to places like Blackstrap Hill and Pleasant Mountain to look at foliage, Two Lights and Reed State Parks to see the surf, and Sebago and Crystal Lakes to swim. Sometimes we just take off and head into what I still think of as Maine's Bermuda Triangle, a series of labyrinthian back roads that no matter which one we took, always somehow ended up at a reed-infested body of water called Runaround Pond. Every one of these families had a kid close to my age, and it was great fun swapping parents. So I could ride in a car with Craig or Richie or Peter. Some parents were more lenient than mine and let us roughhouse or yell or sometimes sing, which made me feel like I was playing hooky from school. Other parents were more strict, making us sit still and whisper, which made me feel like my own parents weren't so bad after all. Watching all these parents interact gave me my first glimpse into the confusing world of being an adult. I couldn't understand why all the men and most of the women puffed on cigarettes, filling the cars with smoke and stinging our eyes. They often spoke in a strange sort of code that I didn't understand and laughed at things that made no sense. Eventually, I learned that many of these comments had to do with sex. And I have a dirty joke here, which I'm going to skip because I'm on TV, but if you want to read it, you can buy the book. And I find that some 70 years later, my parents and their friends still seem to me to belong to a mysterious world beyond my understanding, a world now lost to me forever. When I browse through the 3x3-inch black and white photos in my mother's old albums, these people appear older than their children did at the same age. In their 40s, they look to be in their 50s and 60s. And most of the people there are probably in their 40s. They look to be in their 50s and 60s, probably the result of the cigarettes they smoked and the fatty foods they consumed. My father started the day with eggs and bacon right up until he died at the age of 66. But also probably because compared to today, they looked dressed up. Men wore ties, even on Sunday afternoon drives. And for the most part, women wore dresses. Compared to today, our mothers seldom used profanity, and our fathers used a lot less of it when we were all together. The F word was rare, even among a group of men. On the other hand, all our parents peppered their language with racial and cultural slurs, with epithets for blacks, French Canadians, Italians, indigenous people, gays, even Catholics. I could get my mouth washed out with soap for saying goddamn, but no one did anything except chuckle if I called John Nappy a wop. All our parents were affiliated with either the Congregationalists or the Baptist church in town. But except for my parents and the Haskells, the other families usually attended church only on Christmas and Easter. Their real religion was the United States of America. It was during that time that "under God" was added to the Pledge of Allegiance. One Memorial Day, I was probably 7 or 8, I was walking down the street carrying a full-sized American flag over my shoulder, and Earl Pride yelled at me out the door of his store because the tip of the flag was dragging on the ground. And if their religion was the United States, they worshiped the American dream. New washing machines and dryers, larger television sets and hi-fi record players, pine panel rec rooms, and most of all, new automobiles. It was common to trade in for a new car every couple of years or so, and when one of our parents did, the car became an object of veneration for weeks, with all of us kids scrambling to ride in it on Sunday afternoons. Those Sunday afternoons then became a worship service, celebrating our parents, all of whom had grown up during the Depression, rise into America's great middle class, with freedom to follow new roads to brighter foliage or higher surf or a longer beach. And if they got lost or suddenly found themselves at Runaround Pond, well, it was always next week. It's easy for me to criticize their provincialism and bigotry, and later in the life I did. But maybe because I'm older than most of the men ever got to be, or maybe because I'm aware that I don't have the goals, the dreams that I used to have, I find the energy, the, excuse the pun, drive of these people in the black and white photograph. I also realize I miss the faith I had then in my parents and their friends. Before the advent of Elvis and the generation gap, I believed in them more than I believed in God. I remember one Sunday afternoon drive, it must have been in the late 1940s, when forest fires burned large parts of Maine. One of our parents heard there was a large fire in Brunswick, so we all piled into the cars to go look. I don't remember the fire, only that as we turned the car around to head home, I was in the back seat of Earl Pride's powder blue Dodge with Earl's son, Craig. 1 minute we were horsing around, the next minute Craig was gone. The back door of the Dodge swung open. Earl slammed on the brakes. I looked behind and saw the other cars screeching to stops. Doors opened and Parrish rushed to Craig, who was still rolling in the gravel beside the road. My stomach rose into my throat, leaving a great empty cavern, until I saw Earl lift his screaming son into his arms and bring him back to the car and lay him beside me in the back seat. "He'll be okay," he told his wife Doris. "Just some scrapes and a bump on the head." And Earl was right, because he was just starting to accelerate when the door opened. The car wasn't going very fast. But as far as I was concerned, Craig was never in any real danger. Once his father had him in his arms, I knew he'd be fine. Like me, Craig has had heart surgery. All things considered, however, we're both doing pretty well. Still, other friends have gone this year, some of them almost as suddenly as when Craig disappeared from his father's powder blue Dodge. It seems as if 1 minute they're here, and the next minute they're not. And I find myself searching for some older, wiser voice telling me everything's going to be fine. So that was sort of my way to sort of negotiate the various feelings I had towards not only my parents, but the whole town. And because, as was the case in those days, I just didn't have parents to raise me. I had a whole town, and some of you remember that. I got kicked out of the house at 7 o'clock in the morning summers, and I wasn't expected back until supper time. And what I did was entirely up to me, because everybody knew everybody in town was looking after, was fine, was going to look after us. And but to sort of negotiate that and to try to figure out, okay, try to look at it realistically, not nostalgically. And I think that's, and that takes what's in this book here into the category of what's called memoir. And I'm fascinated by memoir because to me, this is where you have the author trying to come to grips with memory. I mean, a lot of people say that, you know, memoirs are just, well, I had an interesting life, and so therefore I'm going to write my memoirs. But it's more about, to me anyway, it's more about not only the life, but the way you remember your life. And you all know when you get together with your family or when you get together with friends, we don't remember the same way and we don't remember the same things. And that fascinates me. And I've tried to do this in the writing itself to show how I at least have come at my past in a way that maybe the reader will also be challenged to look at his or her past the same way. Which gets me to the second reading, I don't know how we're doing for time here, which deals with, okay, how do I get out of, number one, nostalgia? And how do I accept and become aware of influence? And what I found out is just like a regular pilgrimage, just when you go on a trip or a pilgrimage, you bring back some knowledge, you bring back some awareness, which you can use in the future. And I find that the more I've done this, the more hopeful I've become. I think struggle, like a lot of people my age, to be hopeful these days. And where does my hope come from? And actually, this is not original with me. Well, I wish it were. But, you know, someone told me, hope is not about the future. Hope is about the past. Hope is about looking back at things that you have already overcome. Hope is, if you've got a challenge, if you're worried about the future, what about the obstacles? What about the challenges you've already gone through? And if you did it once, you can do it again. And you can use those parts of your past to prepare for the future. And that's what I've tried to do, I think. And then I want to read something that is sort of an example of that. It's from the end of the book, and it also, I hope, will stir up some memories from some of you. It's called Dancing Lessons. You can show, the other one, the first picture is what sort of inspired me to write it. This, I was just looking for a picture to go along with the reading. And this is from my 1961 yearbook. It's pretty hazy, but it's a prom. I can identify a couple of people there. So that's what we looked like when we went to the prom. No, I'm not. I don't think I went that year. No. But he was a good friend, Doug Turner. What's that? Abbeytown. Okay, that I think was Bruce. Yeah. Do you remember? Yeah. That's a Boyd. I believe that's one of the Boyd. Carol Boyd. Yeah. So anyway, that's just to provide a little. As we former teachers say, this is audiovisual aid. And so, okay, so this is called Dancing Lesson. For many people like my parents, music and dancing are intertwined. But while I have always loved music, from the ragtime my grandmother played on our piano to my CDs of Elvis, Charlie Parker, Willie Nelson, Mozart, and the Carolina Chocolate Drops, I have not always loved dancing. I blame Arthur Murray, who it has been said taught America to dance. In the 1950s, when I first discovered rock and roll and girls, there were over 3,000 Arthur Murray dance studios in the United States. one of which sent instructors. I remember him as 30-ish, with thinning hair, wearing a wrinkled tuxedo, and her as blonde, maybe bleached, in a black strapless dress that showed off her legs and the run in her stocking. Sent them to Yarmouth, Maine, to line us boys up on one side of the room and girls on the other, leaving a no man's land between the sexes that I have spent years trying to cross. Apparently Murray, whose given name was Moses Teichman and who grew up on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, felt that dancing was how people could become more sophisticated and move, as he had, into a better class of society. Besides teaching the steps to the waltz, the foxtrot, the jitterbug, and the cha-cha, and they did it with those little paper steps that they put them on. Remember those that you'd follow them on the floor? The instructors also taught etiquette. Young men were instructed to walk across the floor to young ladies, bow, and say, "May I have this dance?" I have to say, however, that if the aim was to teach refined behavior to 7th and 8th graders, it was not a good idea, after having taught us the steps, to blow a goddamn whistle. The resulting melee resembled the kickoff of a football game, as barely pubertal males raced across the floor, elbowing each other in a furious attempt to get to the 4 or 5 girls with breasts, the fastest and dirtiest fighters skidding to a stop in front of them, yelling, "Have the dance!" while the chosen one stood giggling and the rest of the girls stared at the floor, waiting for us losers to get to them. I learned to see dancing as a fight for survival of the fittest. And when I reached high school, the record hops in the gymnasium buttressed my understanding that dancing was a battle in which I first had to get up the nerve to cross the no man's land between the guys standing along one wall and gals standing along the other, get up the courage to look a girl in the eye, struggle to find something to say, wrestle with how close to get and where to put my hands, and finally retreat without feeling like a coward. Until one night, I didn't retreat. We talked. We laughed. The music continued, and dancing became unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Looking into her eyes, seeing both her and me for the first time, I surrendered my adolescent self-consciousness to an interplay of body, mind, and music. Fast forward 25 years. I'm in Princeton, New Jersey, evaluating high school essays for the College Board. The last night of the reading, a bunch of us teachers are in a bar, bouncing our middle-aged bones around the dance floor to a collection of golden oldies played by some kids in ripped t-shirts. When the band switches from whole lot of shaking going on to I Can't Help Falling in Love with You, the woman I've been twisting with says, "Do you dance slow?" Nearly 40 years later, we still try to get in one slow dance a week. Perhaps because writing these reflections has made me more aware of connections. I'm wondering if my relationship with the God of my not understanding hasn't also been a kind of dancing lesson. In the first years after Laurie died, any contact I had with God felt first like those early Arthur Murray days, trying to follow the directions of well-meaning instructors, navigate the frightening no man's land between God and me, while wrestling with anger, fear, and shame, and then, like the high school dances, getting up the nerve to ask God for help, struggling to find words to express my grief, even grappling with where to put my hands when I pray. Over 30 years later, after Laurie's death, I still sometimes feel like Jacob in the Old Testament, wrestling with, if not God, then with God's angel. And yet, gradually over the years, I have also come to feel embraced, taken into loving arms in a dance to which I can only call the music of grace. Grace not only to survive Laurie's death, but also to have lived a happy, often joy-filled life. And I realize these are the times I've surrendered. Let God lead, if you will, losing and at the same time finding myself in the embrace of a higher power. Both scientists and modern writers on spirituality tell us that everything in the universe, animals, vegetables, minerals, living and dead, is interconnected. Everything exists in relationship. The question for me these days, and I wonder if it isn't a question this country is struggling to answer, is whether the relationship is going to be in the form of a battle or a dance. Whether when I look out my window at tree branches in the wind, I see trees battling the elements or dancing to them. Whether when I see someone of another color or another lifestyle coming towards me on the street, I see an opponent or a partner. Whether I still see the world as us and them lined up on opposite sides of the floor, or whether I see just us, moving like Mary Lee and me on a date night in harmony to the music. So thank you. And now is the time when I'm happy to answer questions. I'd be more than happy. But I'm also curious as to hearing perhaps some of your negotiations, if you will, or some of the ways the past has appeared in your life or hasn't appeared, or how you deal with it, how you use it, how important the past is to you. So I'd also like to hear that as well. And for anybody who's grown up, as some of you have, about the same time that I did here in Yarmouth, I'd love to hear some of your memories as well. So anyway, anything anybody want to ask, say, do?
Well,
yes.
I could just say that I couldn't wait to get out of here. It was the same response that you had. I knew I had to go somewhere.
Did you go to school here in town?
Well, actually, I went to Portland to school, but I grew up in Yarmouth. It's a small town, and you knew there was something else out there.
And when I was growing up, it was very conservative. It was a very conservative town.
Oh, yes.
And I don't know if I don't get the feeling it is anymore, but it was very conservative. So yeah, but you came back.
I did. 50 years later.
50 years later.
But we'd been coming in the summer, so there's always a connection. Yarmouth.
Kenna.
Hi there.
Hi.
Some of you may have the privilege, last night I did, one of the students from the high school, every once in a while they will interview somebody about growing up here and what was Yarmouth like. She had a list of questions about this woman. We spent an hour and a half, really had a wonderful time. One of the questions was, what was Yarmouth like when we were growing up? How had it changed? What didn't we like seeing that's going on now? Did we want to leave? Did we want to move and go someplace else? So really, really good questions, and a lot of you might get interviewed by somebody, but it's just a thing they have to write. But it was really fun. So.
Well, this gives me a chance to also plug something that I've been working a little bit with Katie with. A classmate of mine, whom some of you know, Alan Wilson. This is his project, but I've tried to kind of. He would like to either do a display or have a talk or something like that about growing up in Yarmouth in the 50s and 60s and how the town changed, and sort of focusing on the building of the high school. Because, for those of you that don't know, I am the member of the last class of townies to go to North Yarmouth Academy. And during that time, they were building a high school. And it's, Yarmouth really changed hugely during that period of the 50s and 60s. And one of the things that we're trying to find out, so I'll throw this out to any of you, is anything you can say about what was going on in town when they were building the high school. Because we hear different stories about conflicts, about arguments, but whether that was talk, again, we get into the idea of history, whether that was this talk or whether there really was a lot of disagreement about building, why the high school was built, and what was going on here. We've heard a lot of different stories. So, I know there are town records, what went on in some of the town meeting halls. I started reading some of the old shopping notes, and some of you remember Ken Larrabee, and he was very vocal on his opinions, very much against 295. By the way, he had no use. That was going to ruin the town if they built 295 through here. Oh, that was terrible. So if there's anything that some of you have, any information that you have, you're starting a collection about that, and then possibly, at some point, either doing a display or something. Yeah.
You were the last graduating class, Cheryl, Judy, myself, were the class that got split in half.
Right.
And what went on the two sides was completely different. We never had any idea what was going on the other side, and it was really, really interesting. I didn't find it out for a very long time.
Yeah, well, I think some sort of discussion, I think you'd be up for that. Some sort of discussion about what was going on at the time.
The rift that happened in our class was really, really severe. We'd been going to school together since kindergarten, some of us. In the last year of high school, our class was divided in half, with half going to the new high school and half staying at the academy. My mother, 2 aunts, an uncle, and my brother all graduated from the academy, except me. It was hard to that last year. It did change. I think you were talking about when Yarmouth changed. It may have been around that time.
Well, I think, I think the key thing was the building of the bridge and Central Maine Power. I think when they put that in, that lowered the tax base, and it also brought in people to work in the power plant. And so, you had people coming into Yarmouth, and, for generations, people who lived in Yarmouth had lived, the families had lived here forever. My mother's family, who was related to Kenna, they go back to the Revolutionary War. And there were a lot of people like that. So that they were sort of ingrown, and then all of a sudden new people started coming in. And that made a big difference and a big change. So, thank you. Anything else anybody want to? Yeah.
I was interested in your comment that the 1957 was identified as the best year.
Right.
Because in my experience, and I'm from MDI, so I had Mr. Wile for high school English in 1973. And what, in my experience, my friends, my class of 142 at MDIHS, we all knew everybody. We all remember it as fabulous. Even the backsiders we liked on the western half of the island. And so I'm really interested whenever I talk to other people that they don't even remember most of the people's names in their classes. And I just always am shocked because we all talk all the time on Facebook now, but we always talked before then. So I guess I would be really interested to know if the fact that most of us were born in 1956, which is just shy of the best year of the world, if that year was actually a golden year in other places, because it doesn't seem to be that way in my experience.
Well, I have, again,
babies born then.
Yeah.
The parents identified that as a
But
good year.
I was going to say, this is something that a lot of people are looking back with nostalgia. 1957 was a great year, unless you were female, unless you were black, Catholic, perhaps, or certainly indigenous. Homosexual, forget it. It was a great year for some people, but it was not a great year for a lot of people. And I think that's you start, and you can look at the news, what was going on in 1957. Sputnik, we were scared to death. This is still, the evil commies, the Russians. I don't recall 57 as being a particularly great year, But that's just, again, that's nostalgia, I think, talking. But I because I, do have
Ours was the best class, though. You
Right, I was
said
going to
that.
say, because I
Yes,
have a
yes.
stake in your class.
Yeah.
And I have been sort of following around with it. But I think that's true of Mount Desert Island. I mean, it's like Yarmouth. It had a center. But what you may or may not remember, is when Mount Desert Island built the high school in 1969, it had taken them 20 years to get the voters convinced to build a regional school because they didn't want to ruin the basketball rivalries. And that first year I was there, the Bar Harbor kids sat here, and the Southwest kids sat here, and the Northeast Harbor kids sat here, and there was very little interaction between the groups. It took about to your class to begin to pull things together. But anyway, other comments or questions before I don't know what time it is, but anybody have any? Okay, all right, Kenneth.
When we graduated, women started going out to work, and college started being promoted. Up until then, you either became a housewife, or you were a teacher, or you were a nurse, or a secretary, and that was it. And then we started pushing college.
John?
You mentioned thinking back to 61. I think you were talking about the basketball championships and stuff like that. I think about those times too. I think about what occurs to me is between the ages of 8 and 18, it seems like everything happened. It took forever. It was a long period of time. It was only 10 years. 10 years. And that's a time when we all remember an awful lot of it, more than any other 10 years in our lives, I think. Even though those other 10 years, when we found and married and had children, was probably much more important. I don't know, those 10 years, everybody had their own 57.
Yeah. No, I think you're right. And well, that was when stop and think of all the stuff we learned. Some of which I've had to unlearn. But yes, it's there was a lot going on at that time, and a lot of influence. I mean, there's a lot of and that gets us into the idea of the past. And on the one hand, one of my favorite authors, William Faulkner, said, the past is not over, the past is not even past. That we continue to be influenced by our past and the way we see it. Then we have this other book that talks about the past being a foreign country. I think both are true. But I think one of the things that I realize is that I am influenced, especially in times of crisis. This happened to me not long ago, actually. Something happened, and I flew into this rage, absolute rage. And it was this helpless rage, and it was nothing. I'm going to do, I don't know what I'm going to do, but I'm going to do. And I realized that's 16-year-old me talking. Something tapped into some 16-year-old that's still rattling around in these old bones. And I realized that's something that is still there. And it helps, I think, to recognize that and to accept it, and then to say, okay, do I need to change this? And I think a lot of who we are now is who we were when. There's a book by that, isn't there? A book like called
What We Are is What We Were When.
What We Are is What We Were When. And what's the? Yeah, apparently the premise of the book is whatever you lacked at the age of 10 years old, you will spend the rest of your life trying to get. And it, whether it's money, whether it's success, whatever it is. And so, that's an interesting thing here.
It's not actually a book. It was something that it was one of my professors in terms of teaching put on the board for us. And we watched a film. It was a film, and it was for advertisers. How do you get people? Find out what they were lacking when they were 10, and you can, try and provide that. But it was also, because we were training to be teachers, how to get to know your students. What was 10 years old like? What did you love? What did you lack? As a way to. So it was a. I was going to say video. There were no videos then. It was a film.
Anything else anybody would like to know or ask or share? Yes.
I'm not from Yarmouth. I'm a Vermonter.
Ah.
But people ask me, where did I grow up? And I said, well, I haven't grown up yet, but I was born and raised in Rutland, Vermont.
For someone who wrote a book called The Geriatric Pilgrim about his travels, the only other place I've ever lived besides Maine was Vermont. I lived there for 4 years, and then got homesick, and moved back to Maine. That's when I wound up on MDI. Anyway. Well, okay. Well, thank you very much, and thank you. The book, little shameless self-promotion. The book is out there. Should you want to buy a copy, and all proceeds will go to the History Center. So if you'd like to support the History Center, you can buy a copy. I'd be happy to sign it if anybody wanted to. So thank you very
Let's
much.
talk about some of your physical pilgrimages as well as your.
Yeah, it does. Yeah, I did. I picked them for this particular audience. But yeah, there are a lot of different places we did go. Yes.
You also went inside on every one of them. Yeah.
But anyway, thank you so much.